What happens when a company grows so powerful it terrifies the world's biggest superpower? One company went from selling vegetables in rural China to becoming America's most feared technological threat. But when the world's most powerful government declared war on them and tried to destroy them completely, they did something nobody expected, something that changed the game forever. This is Huawei, a company that built the internet backbone for half the planet, dominated the smartphone wars against Apple and Samsung, then watched it all crumble when they became the center of a global spy thriller that reads like a Hollywood blockbuster. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic corporate stories of our time, how a small Chinese startup became a tech giant, survived an economic death sentence that should have killed them, and somehow emerged stronger and more dangerous than ever before. But here's the twist. What looked like the end of Huawei may just have been the beginning of its most powerful chapter, because the real question isn't how they survived, it's what they're planning next, and why it has America more terrified than ever. Picture this. 1987. While most of the world was obsessing over Coca-Cola and MTV, a 43-year-old former military engineer named Ren Zhengfei was about to change everything. With just $5,000 in borrowed money, he founded Huawei in a cramped apartment in Shenzhen, China, a city that was barely more than a fishing village at the time. But here's the incredible part. Ren wasn't some tech prodigy with a computer science degree. He'd been selling vegetables and running a small electronics business. The name Huawei literally means China can do it. And that wasn't just optimism. It was prophecy. Ren's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to compete head-on with Western giants like Siemens, Ericsson, and Alcatel, Huawei focused on rural China, villages and towns completely ignored by foreign companies. While the big players fought over lucrative city contracts, Huawei quietly built their empire in the countryside, one telephone switch at a time. Their first breakthrough came when China decided to modernize its telephone infrastructure. While foreign companies were charging premium prices for outdated equipment, Huawei offered something revolutionary: better technology at half the price. They weren't just undercutting competitors, they were obliterating them. By the early 1990s, something extraordinary was happening. Huawei wasn't just surviving, they were thriving. But this was only the beginning of their incredible journey. The late 1990s marked the beginning of Huawei's meteoric rise, and Ren Zhengfei's military background started showing. He ran Huawei like a war machine. Engineers worked 12-hour shifts, sleeping on office floors, driven by his iron discipline and a singular obsession: make China technologically independent. But here's what separated Huawei from every other Chinese company of that era. They weren't just copying Western technology, they were innovating. Ren made a decision that seemed crazy at the time. He reinvested heavily in R&D, sometimes spending more than 10% of revenue on research. He famously told his engineers, "Huawei's success depends on eating grass while a horse runs." China's economic boom created an insatiable demand for telecommunications infrastructure, and Huawei positioned itself as the domestic champion. But they had bigger ambitions. By 2005, half of Huawei's revenue was coming from overseas. They were winning contracts in Africa, South America, and eventually Europe, places Western companies had largely ignored or overcharged. Western rivals initially laughed at Huawei. Cheap knockoffs, they called them. But soon, they weren't laughing anymore. Huawei's products weren't just cheaper, they were better, and that terrified the competition. The 2000s transformation was complete. While Apple was launching the iPhone and Google was organizing the world's information, Huawei was quietly building the invisible infrastructure that made it all possible. They were no longer just a Chinese company. They were becoming a global force. The 2010s saw Huawei transform from infrastructure provider to consumer powerhouse. They entered the smartphone market with a bold strategy that would make even Steve Jobs proud: create premium devices that rivaled Apple and Samsung. But at accessible prices, Huawei poured billions into their high silicon chip division, giving birth to the Kirin processor, China's first real competitor to Qualcomm's dominance. Their flagship phones, like the Huawei P-series and Mate series, weren't just smartphones. They were statements. Their cameras, co-developed with German optics giant Leica, were taking photos that made iPhone users genuinely jealous. But smartphones were just the beginning. Huawei became the global leader in telecom infrastructure, rolling out 4G networks in dozens of countries while preparing for the next revolution, 5G. And here's where the story gets really interesting. 5G wasn't just faster internet. It was the backbone for AI, autonomous vehicles, smart cities, and military communications. Whoever controlled 5G would control the future, and Huawei was leading the race by miles. By 2018, Huawei had achieved what seemed impossible just a decade earlier. They were the world's second-largest smartphone manufacturer, ahead of Apple. Their 5G technology was so advanced that even their competitors admitted it was the best available. European governments were planning to build their next-generation networks using Huawei equipment. Ren Zhengfei's village vegetable seller had become a tech emperor, commanding a global empire worth over $100 billion. But success breeds enemies, and Huawei had made the biggest one possible. To Washington, Huawei wasn't just a company, it was Chinese. And in the new world of tech Cold Wars, that made it dangerous. Perhaps the most dangerous company on Earth. The fears weren't entirely unfounded. Huawei's deep connections to the Chinese government, Ren Zhengfei's military background, and China's laws requiring companies to assist intelligence services created a perfect storm of suspicion. The U.S. accused Huawei of being a Trojan horse for Beijing, spying on countries, stealing data, and threatening national security. Whether these accusations were true or not hardly mattered. What mattered was perception, and the perception was terrifying. How could America allow a Chinese company to build the infrastructure for 5G networks in allied countries? What if those networks contained backdoors for Chinese intelligence? What if Huawei's dominance meant China could spy on or even shut down communications across the globe? The first strike came in 2018 when the U.S. banned federal agencies from using Huawei equipment. But the real drama began on December 1, 2018. Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's chief financial officer, and Ren Zhengfei's daughter, was arrested at Vancouver Airport during a flight connection. The charges? Violating U.S. sanctions on Iran. But this wasn't just about sanctions. This was the opening move in a tech Cold War that would reshape the global economy. What happened next was unprecedented in modern business history. The U.S. government didn't just compete with Huawei, they tried to completely destroy it. May 2019, Huawei was placed on the Entity List, effectively banning American companies from doing business with them. The impact was immediate and devastating. Google revoked Huawei's Android license overnight. Intel stopped supplying processors. Qualcomm cut off mobile chips. Microsoft ended software support. TSMC, the world's leading chipmaker, was forbidden from supplying advanced processors. Imagine waking up one day to find that your smartphone couldn't update, your computer couldn't run Windows, and your internet relied on equipment that couldn't receive security patches. This was Huawei's nightmare, and it was just the beginning. The timing couldn't have been worse. Huawei was on the verge of overtaking Samsung as the world's largest smartphone manufacturer. Their 5G equipment was being deployed globally. They were winning the future. Instead, they faced an existential crisis. Without Google services, their smartphones became nearly useless outside China. Without American semiconductors, they couldn't manufacture new devices. Countries that had planned to use Huawei's 5G equipment began reconsidering under intense U.S. pressure. The fall was brutal and swift. Sales plummeted from 240 million phones in 2019 to almost nothing internationally by 2021. Shelves in Europe that once proudly displayed Huawei devices were now empty. International contracts evaporated. Employees faced an uncertain future. The company's global image shattered. Most companies would have died here. Any rational business would have surrendered. But Ren Zhengfei wasn't rational. He was a survivor. Here's where the story gets truly remarkable. Instead of surrendering, instead of begging for mercy, Huawei did something that shocked the entire business world. They doubled down on independence. Ren Zhengfei had always prepared for war. For years, he had told employees, "Imagine America cuts off our supply chain tomorrow. What will we do?" While other companies assumed global cooperation would last forever, Huawei had been quietly stockpiling chips, developing backup systems, and pouring billions into self-reliance. The response was swift and systematic. If Google wouldn't provide Android services, Huawei would create Harmony OS. If American companies wouldn't supply chips, HiSilicon would design better ones. If Western countries wouldn't buy their 5G equipment, they'd focus on markets that valued technology over politics. The company restructured entirely. Non-essential divisions were sold or spun off. Resources were concentrated on core technologies, semiconductors, operating systems, and 5G infrastructure. They increased R&D spending even as revenues declined, betting their future on innovation rather than market share. Huawei became a symbol of resilience in China. Its struggles were framed as a fight against American technological oppression, rallying massive nationalist support. But symbolism wasn't enough. They needed results. And then, in 2023, they delivered something that changed everything. 2023 marked a turning point that sent shockwaves through the entire global tech industry. After years of declining smartphone sales and countless predictions of Huawei's demise, something extraordinary happened. The Huawei Mate 60 Pro launched without fanfare, without press conferences, without the usual marketing blitz. It simply appeared in Chinese stores. Tech analysts who dissected the device discovered something that should have been impossible. A 7-nanometer Kirin 9000s processor manufactured entirely within China, using Chinese equipment and Chinese technology. This wasn't supposed to exist. U.S. sanctions had specifically targeted China's ability to produce advanced semiconductors. American officials had assured the world that cutting off access to Western chip-making technology would cripple Chinese tech companies for decades. Yet here was proof that the restrictions had not just failed, they had backfired spectacularly. Huawei had achieved something that seemed impossible just months earlier: complete technological independence in one of the most complex manufacturing processes on Earth. The implications were staggering and terrifying for America. If Huawei could produce cutting-edge processors without Western technology, what else could they do? If Chinese companies could innovate around sanctions rather than surrender to them, what did this mean for American technological dominance? Stock markets reacted immediately. American semiconductor companies saw their shares plummet as investors realized their Chinese customers might no longer need them. Defense analysts began reassessing the effectiveness of technology sanctions as diplomatic weapons. Sales of the Mate 60 Pro skyrocketed in China. Waiting lists stretched for weeks. Huawei wasn't just back. They were back with a vengeance. Today's Huawei is fundamentally different from the company that dominated headlines in 2019. They're smaller in some ways. Their smartphone business outside China remains a shadow of its former self. But they're also more dangerous to competitors than ever before. They've become genuinely independent. Their Harmony OS ecosystem is growing rapidly across China and beginning to expand globally, powering not just smartphones, but cars, smart home devices, and industrial equipment. Their 5G technology remains the most advanced available, and sanctions have only made them more determined to innovate. Most importantly, they've proven something that terrifies Washington. American technology restrictions can be overcome with sufficient investment, determination, and time. The company that started by selling vegetables has become something unprecedented in modern business, a tech giant that operates largely outside the Western ecosystem while remaining globally competitive. They've shown other Chinese companies and the world that independence from American suppliers isn't just possible, it's profitable. But perhaps the most significant change is philosophical. Ren Zhengfei's Huawei once sought partnership and integration with Western companies. Today's Huawei accepts that technological competition is the new reality and embraces it with the fervor of a company that has survived its own execution. The clash between Huawei and America isn't just a corporate rivalry. It's the front line of a much bigger struggle. Who controls the future of technology, America or China? Huawei's rise, fall, and rise again mirrors China's own story. Once dismissed as imitators, now recognized as legitimate challengers to the global technological order. And despite every obstacle, every sanction, every attempt to destroy them, Huawei stands tall again, proving that even when you try to cut down a giant, it can regrow stronger, smarter, and more independent than before. The rise, fall, and rise of Huawei isn't just a business story. It's a preview of the future, a future where technological ecosystems compete as fiercely as nations, where innovation happens everywhere, not just in Silicon Valley, and where yesterday's impossibility becomes tomorrow's breakthrough. Huawei began as a small company selling phone switches in rural China. It rose to dominate global telecoms and challenge Apple's smartphone supremacy, only to be struck down by the full force of American geopolitical power. But instead of dying quietly, it reinvented itself, defying every prediction, overcoming every obstacle, and coming back with even greater determination and capability. The question was never whether Huawei would survive. Ren Zhengfei had survived famines, political persecution, and business failures before. The question was what they would become. And now we know, they've become something more dangerous than a successful company. They've become proof that the American tech empire isn't invincible. Huawei's story isn't just about business or technology. It's about survival, resilience, and the price of independence in a world where technology is power, and power decides who controls the future. The tech war is just getting started, and Huawei's resurrection is only the first act in a much larger drama that will reshape our world.